The first objection, that being historical inquiry lacks direct access to what it studies, can be viewed in at least two ways. We can take the objector to mean either that the historian, through his own representations, captures a relativistic past, but fails to capture any overarching history, or we can take the objector to mean and to indicate that historical methodology is imprecise because of the lack of direct access, or in other words, we can't really know what happened because we weren't there. The first understanding uses the lack of direct access as a support to strengthen the objection from postmodern history, and I will examine that in the section dealing with that, part 4. We will therefore be concerned with the second understanding. This understanding seems to carry some weight, more than the first in my opinion, but it is still not as devastating as some may think. Consider the following 4 comparisons between historical methodology and scientific inquiry to see why this is so. First, in light of the lack of direct access of the objects that history studies, historians typically hold their conclusions provisionally. That is, they believe that their conclusions are probably true. So we're dealing with probability versus certainty. McCullagh writes, quote, "If the evidence in support of an explanatory hypothesis is strong, and there's no alternative hypothesis supported nearly as well, it is reasonable to believe it is probably true, at least for the time being," end quote. This is much akin to the relationship science has with its own hypotheses. That is, both history and science can be disproved by new data. The strength of this objection, then, points to the fact that historians are not justified in holding to absolute certainty that an event occurred, but rather only provisional certainty. However, that being made clear, consider Michael Licona's insight into provisional conclusions. Quote, "The inability to obtain absolute certainty does not prohibit historians from having adequate certainty. Careful examined inferences are generally reliable, and it is reasonable to believe that they correctly describe what actually occurred when the historian's biases is mature. He has been deliberate in serious attempts to minimize the negative impacts of those biases, and he has followed proper methodology. Even scientists must admit that their theories, though probably true, may be discarded tomorrow as a result of new data. Yet this does not prohibit them from starting and stating that their theory probably describes the state of reality, even though it must be held as provisional," end quote. What's more, the idea that certainty equals knowledge is also deeply problematic and has been subjected to multiple arguments to the contrary. This comparison between history and science illuminates the similarities between each. But is this comparison valid? Doesn't science have what history lacks, that is, direct access? Well, this leads me to my second point. That is, history is not at a disadvantage for lacking direct access because other tools in our toolbox also lack direct access, and yet they yield trustworthy results. Consider scientific investigation, for example, and the scientific method. It would be naive to think that scientists always have direct access to the objects they study. Not only is the scientists dependent on indirect reports of others' research and experimentation, which constitutes as reliance on historical documentation, but also the objects being studied are often indirectly accessible to the scientist. For example, consider the theoretical field of physics, which constitutes such entities as black holes, quarks, and neutrinos. These entities are postulated on the best explanation from observable data, but cannot be directly observed. Or consider the astronomer who looks through a telescope at a distant galaxy. She observes it as it existed thousands of years ago, if not longer, and after it has been distorted by the gravitational tugs from other galaxies and trillions of miles of interstellar dust. Yet I don't know of anyone who would suggest that science as a whole, or physics in particular, is untrustworthy because it does not have direct access to these entities. In a similar vein, historical hypotheses can be constructed via indirect access on the peripheral effects of the events, example letters, or documents, or archaeological findings. Thus, critics who hold to this objection should be careful in their application, otherwise they may be guilty of holding to a double standard when it comes to scientific investigation. Third, while historians do not have direct access to the past, they do have things that really existed in the past, or in other words, they have tangible evidence. This can be likened to science's observations of the effects of a postulated entity, again, black holes or quarks, things like that. As previously mentioned, historians have access to many sources of tangible evidence via archaeology, linguistics, sociology, anthropology, and numismatics. To think that the historian is solely dependent on the reports of earlier historians would be also naive. Moreover, when the historians make a conscientious effort to remove bias and follow a critical and logical method, this contributes to the validity of his or her conclusions. Fourth, it is not only historians that struggle with biases in their conclusions, if I might take a rabbit trail. Scientists also operate within worldviews, which are intimately linked to scientific theory. This can lead to observations that are not necessarily neutral, but rather theory-laden. Therefore, what constitutes as a fact can be determined by worldview, leading to the same dilemma within science as it is inherent within historical inquiry. Again, scientific theories are constructions, which are not exclusively based on objective facts, since what constitutes as a fact is based off worldview and theory on occasion, and therefore cannot claim to describe the world as it actually is with neutrality. Now, hopefully these comparisons have made the impact of the lack of direct access objection more clear, and established that reasonable conclusions can be made with adequate certainty as it is with scientific conclusions. In peer-edited and critical practice, science and history often follow the same general methodology, i.e. by their logical consistency and ability to explain the evidence. It would be incongruous to say that the methods of the historian are inferior to science, for the historian typically borrows the same model of explanation that scientists use, i.e. the hypothetical deductive model. The historian invents a hypothesis to provide explanation for facts. He does this by reconstructing a picture of the past. The historian then deduces from the hypotheses specific conditions that confirm or disprove the hypotheses by historical evidence, such as archaeology, let's say. The historian's hypotheses must be corroborated by evidence, otherwise the hypothesis fails and is subjected to peer review. In addition to the hypothetical deductive model, Behan McCullagh's work has provided an inference to the best possible explanation model, which appeared in numerous works that I've read recently as of late. McCullagh's approach is inductive in nature, meaning it starts with available evidence and then deduces the best possible explanation. Within this model, when a scientist would test hypotheses by performing experiments, the historian tests hypotheses by seeing how well those hypotheses clarify historical evidence. For example, consider the 6-point framework of Behan McCullagh's inductive model in the description here. So established, because of the analogous nature between history and science, and because of the methods historians have implemented and have begun to implement more, it seems untenable to maintain that historical inquiry is inferior to or insufficient in establishing evidence because of a lack of direct access.